From newspaper blankets to shelters, the millionaire who built 100 homes for street children. Tonight, while you're getting ready for bed, there's a kid in Los Angeles sleeping under a freeway overpass with nothing but a torn cardboard box and yesterday's newspaper. 15 years ago, that kid was him. Today, he just cut the ribbon on his 100th shelter for homeless children across America. This is the story of how a boy who slept in dumpsters became the millionaire who's housing thousands of kids who remind him of who he used to be. What you're about to hear sounds impossible, and honestly, if I hadn't verified every single detail, I wouldn't believe it either. According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, over 4 million children experience homelessness in America every single year. Most of their stories end in tragedy, addiction, or a lifetime of survival mode. But this one ends with 100 shelters, millions of dollars invested in broken kids, and a legacy that's rewriting what's possible when someone refuses to forget where they came from. Stay with me, because the decisions this man made at his lowest points will challenge everything you think you know about wealth, success, and what it really means to make it in America. Before we dive in, I need to be clear about something. This isn't a story about luck, and it's definitely not about some magical handout that changed everything overnight. What you're going to hear is a series of impossible choices made by someone who had every reason to give up but somehow found a way to keep moving forward. The gap between sleeping on concrete and building a nonprofit empire isn't filled with inspirational quotes or easy answers. It's filled with fear, doubt, hunger, and moments where the wrong decision could have ended everything. But it's also filled with one person's refusal to let his past define his future. And that's where this gets interesting. He doesn't remember a time when he felt safe. The earliest memory he has is being 6 years old, huddled behind a dumpster in South Los Angeles, trying to stay warm while police sirens screamed a few blocks away. His mother had disappeared 3 days earlier. She'd done it before, but this time, she didn't come back. For the next 7 years, the streets raised him. He learned to identify which gas stations had bathrooms that stayed unlocked at night. He learned which public libraries would let him sleep in the corner if he pretended to read. He learned that if you timed it right, you could grab leftover food from the loading docks behind restaurants in Santa Monica before the workers threw it away. He learned that adults either ignored you completely or looked at you like you were already dead. And he learned that if you cried, if you showed weakness, the older kids on the streets would take whatever little you had left. So he stopped crying. He stopped asking for help. He became invisible, because invisible meant survival. Every single night he would find a spot under the 110 freeway overpass, pull a cardboard box over his body, and wonder if tomorrow would be the day it all finally ended. And for a long time he hoped it would be. Everything changed the day he got caught stealing a sandwich from a 7-Eleven on Wilshire Boulevard. He was 13 years old, starving, and too tired to run when the store manager grabbed his arm. But instead of calling the cops, the manager did something unexpected. He sat the kid down in the back office, made him eat the sandwich, and asked him one question. "Where are your parents?" The kid didn't answer. He'd learned a long time ago that telling adults the truth only made things worse. But the manager didn't push. Instead, he made a phone call. 20 minutes later, a woman named Sarah walked into that store. She worked for a nonprofit called Covenant House, and she told him something nobody had ever said before. "You don't have to do this alone." He didn't trust her. Why would he? Every adult in his life had either abandoned him or hurt him. But Sarah didn't give up. She showed up at his usual sleeping spot under the freeway for 3 weeks straight, bringing food, blankets, and the same offer. "We have a bed. You can leave any time. No police, no foster care, just a bed." On the 22nd night, it rained so hard that the cardboard box disintegrated around him. He was shivering, soaked, and too exhausted to fight anymore. So he said yes. That decision, that one fragile yes in a moment of total desperation, became the hinge on which his entire life would turn. And he still didn't know it yet. But saying yes didn't fix anything. The shelter gave him a bed, hot meals, and access to a GED program. But the fear never left. He would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced someone was going to take it all away. He didn't know how to trust people who were nice to him. It felt like a trap. And in some ways, it was a test. Child Protective Services wanted to place him in foster care. They said it was the right thing to do, the legal thing to do. But he'd heard the stories. He'd met kids who'd been cycled through 5, 6, 7 different homes, each one worse than the last. He didn't want to be someone's charity case. He didn't want to smile politely while strangers pretended to care. So he made a choice that terrified him. He told Sarah he'd rather go back to the streets than enter the system. And instead of forcing him, she fought for him. She convinced the nonprofit to let him stay in their transitional housing program, even though he was technically too young. She became his advocate, his stability, and the first adult who kept her word. But the hardest part wasn't accepting help. The hardest part was believing he deserved it. Because somewhere deep down, after years of being invisible, he'd started to believe he was worth exactly what the world had given him. Nothing. Learning to dream again meant unlearning that lie, one painful day at a time. And it almost broke him. At 16, he got his GED. At 17, he enrolled in community college with a Pell Grant and started working night shifts at a McDonald's in Koreatown. The work was brutal. He'd finish his shift at 2 in the morning, sleep for 4 hours in the shelter, then drag himself to campus for 8 o'clock classes. But for the first time in his life, he had something that felt like a future. He started taking business classes, not because he had some grand plan, but because he wanted to understand how people built things that lasted. He wanted to know how the world worked for people who weren't just trying to survive. His professors noticed. One of them, a retired entrepreneur named Mr. Carlson, pulled him aside after class one day and asked what he wanted to do with his life. He didn't have an answer, but Mr. Carlson did. He handed him a book called The Lean Startup and said, "Read this, then come back and tell me what you think." That book rewired his brain. It taught him that you didn't need money or connections to build something valuable. You needed a problem worth solving and the guts to test your ideas in the real world. And he knew exactly what problem he wanted to solve. He'd lived it. So he started sketching out an idea. What if there was a way to help homeless kids find work without requiring an address or a phone or all the things that kept them locked out of the system? What if someone built a platform that connected them directly to day labor gigs, freelance opportunities, and training programs? It sounded impossible, but so did everything else he'd already done. And this time, impossible felt like an invitation. He spent 2 years building the platform in secret. He taught himself how to code using free YouTube tutorials and library computers. He tested early versions with kids still living on Skid Row, refining the app based on their feedback. He pitched the idea at a local startup competition and lost. Then he pitched again and again. On his 7th attempt, a small venture capital firm in Pasadena took a chance on him. They gave him $50,000 in seed funding. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Within 6 months, his app had connected over 2,000 homeless youth to paid work. Within a year, nonprofits across California were using his platform to coordinate job placements and skills training. Within 3 years, he had 15 employees, partnerships with major companies like Starbucks and Target, and a Series A funding round that valued his startup at $12 million. He was 24 years old. He'd gone from sleeping under a freeway to appearing on the cover of Forbes Under 30. He bought his first apartment in Silver Lake, his first car, his first real bed. And for the first time since he was a kid, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was going to be okay. But success brought something he didn't expect. Guilt. Because every time he drove past Skid Row, every time he saw kids sleeping in the same places he used to sleep, he felt like a traitor, like he'd escaped and left everyone else behind. The money didn't fix that. The recognition didn't fix that. And he realized that if he wanted to feel whole again, he had to go back. By the time he turned 28, his company had been acquired by a major tech firm for $47 million. He walked away with $18 million after taxes and investor payouts. $18 million. More money than he'd ever imagined. He bought a house in Venice Beach, a Tesla, and spent exactly 2 months trying to figure out what rich people were supposed to do with their time. And he hated every second of it. The house felt empty. The car felt ridiculous. The parties, the networking events, the venture capital mixers. All of it felt like a performance. He'd spent his whole life trying to escape poverty, and now that he didn't recognize himself. He started having panic attacks. He'd wake up at 3 in the morning convinced he was back under the freeway, that everything had been a dream. His therapist told him he was experiencing a delayed trauma response, that his nervous system was finally processing everything he'd survived. But he knew what it really was. He'd built a life that didn't mean anything, and that realization nearly destroyed him. One night, he drove to Skid Row and parked his Tesla right in the middle of the chaos. He watched kids dig through trash cans, He watched families sleeping on sidewalks, and he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He was going to build something that mattered, not for investors, not for his ego, but for the kids who were still living the nightmare he'd escaped. He was going to build shelters, 100 of them, and he wasn't going to stop until every single one of them had a place to sleep. But turning that vision into reality almost killed him. Setting up a nonprofit meant navigating a bureaucratic nightmare. He had to apply for 501c3 status, file mountains of paperwork, and convince city officials that his shelters wouldn't become magnets for crime. Every neighborhood he approached said the same thing. We support helping the homeless, just not here. NIMBYism, they called it. Not in my backyard. Wealthy communities in Santa Monica and Pasadena fought his proposals with lawyers and petitions. Working-class neighborhoods in South LA and Compton were too broke to offer land or funding. And every time he walked into a zoning meeting or a city council hearing, he could feel the skepticism in the room. Who was this kid? What made him think he could solve a problem that governments and charities had been failing at for decades? But he had one advantage. He knew what those kids needed because he'd been one of them. He knew they didn't need sermons or pity or temporary handouts. They needed safety, stability, and someone who believed they were worth investing in. So he stopped asking for permission and started buying land. Cheap lots in industrial areas, abandoned warehouses, foreclosed properties. He hired architects who specialized in low-cost, high-impact design. He partnered with local contractors who agreed to work at cost. And in 2019, he opened his first shelter in Long Beach. It had beds for 30 kids, a commercial kitchen, a computer lab, and a full-time social worker. The first kid who walked through the door was a 14-year-old girl who'd been sleeping in a park for 6 months. She looked at the bed, looked at him, and asked, "What's the catch?" He told her there wasn't one. She didn't believe him, and he understood why. Building one shelter was hard. Building 100 felt impossible. But he'd learned something important. If you solve the problem once, you can solve it again. He created a replicable model. Standard layouts, predictable costs, partnerships with local governments to reduce red tape. He recruited other millionaires who'd come from nothing and convinced them to fund shelters in their hometowns. He trained former homeless youth to become staff members because they understood the fear and mistrust better than any social worker ever could. And slowly, the map started filling in. Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Houston, Phoenix, Seattle, New York, Denver. Every city had its own challenges. In Chicago, winter weather required upgraded heating systems. In Phoenix, the heat meant investing in industrial-grade air conditioning. In Seattle, zoning laws forced him to partner with churches and community centers. But every single shelter followed the same core principle. Treat these kids like they matter. Because they do. By 2023, he'd opened 60 shelters. By 2024, 85. And this year, he opened his 100th in Detroit. 100 shelters, beds for over 3,000 kids every single night. And the best part? He wasn't the only one doing it anymore. Other entrepreneurs, other survivors, other people who'd crawled out of impossible situations were starting to build their own versions of what he'd created. The movement was bigger than him now, and that's exactly what he wanted. The thing about building shelters is that you don't get to control what happens after the kids leave. Some of them thrive, some of them relapse, some of them disappear, but every single one of them gets a chance. And that chance matters. There's a kid named Marcus who stayed in the Long Beach shelter for 2 years. He'd been living in his mom's car after she lost her job during the pandemic. The shelter gave him stability, tutoring, and a part-time job doing maintenance. Last year, he graduated high school with honors and got a full ride to UCLA. There's a girl named Amaya who stayed in the Houston shelter after aging out of foster care. She'd bounced between 12 different homes and didn't trust anyone. The shelter staff didn't push her. They just showed up. Every day. Eventually, she started opening up. Now she's enrolled in a nursing program and volunteers at the shelter on weekends. There's a teenager named Elijah who stayed in the Chicago shelter for 6 months before running away. He came back 3 times. Each time, the staff let him in without judgment. On his 4th try, he stayed. He's 19 now, working at a FedEx distribution center and saving up for his own apartment. These stories don't always have happy endings, but they have beginnings. And sometimes that's enough, because the alternative is a kid sleeping under a freeway with no one who gives a damn. And he refuses to let that be the only option. When people ask him what it feels like to go from homeless to millionaire, he never knows what to say. Because the truth is, he still feels like that scared kid under the overpass. The trauma doesn't go away just because you have money. The hypervigilance doesn't disappear. The fear that it could all collapse at any moment, that never leaves. But what does change is your ability to do something about it. He can't fix the foster care system. He can't solve income inequality or the affordable housing crisis, but he can make sure that 3,000 kids go to sleep tonight in a bed instead of on concrete. And when he visits the shelters, when he sees kids who remind him of who he used to be, something shifts. It's not closure, it's not healing, but it's purpose. And purpose is the closest thing he's found to peace. Last month he opened a shelter in Philadelphia. A 15-year-old girl walked in, looked around, and asked the same question that first girl in Long Beach asked. "What's the catch?" He smiled and said, "No catch, just a bed." She didn't believe him, but she stayed. And 3 weeks later, she told the staff that it was the first time in 2 years she'd slept through the night without waking up scared. That's what it's all about. Not the accolades, not the press, not the Forbes articles or the TED Talks. It's that one girl sleeping through the night. Multiply that by 3,000. That's the number that matters. There's a concept in psychology called repetition compulsion. It's the idea that we unconsciously recreate the conditions of our trauma in an attempt to master it. For years, he thought that's what he was doing, building shelters because he couldn't save himself back then, trying to rewrite the story by giving other kids the ending he almost didn't get. But his therapist told him something that changed his perspective. She said, "You're not trying to save yourself. You're trying to prove that you were always worth saving." And maybe that's true. Maybe every shelter is a middle finger to every adult who ignored him, every system that failed him, every moment when the world told him he didn't matter. Maybe it's his way of saying, "I was worth it, and so are they." The circle doesn't close, it expands. Because one of the kids from his first shelter, a young man named David, just graduated from Stanford with a degree in social work. And last week, David called him with a proposal. He wants to open 50 more shelters across the country using the same model. He's already secured initial funding. He's already identified cities with the greatest need. And he wants to do it because someone gave him a chance when he had nothing. The cycle continues, not because he's a hero, but because he refused to let his pain be meaningless. And now, an entire generation of kids is learning that their pain doesn't have to be meaningless either. Right now, there are plans for 200 shelters by 2030. That's the goal. 200 safe places for kids who've been told they don't deserve safety. He's partnering with major corporations, local governments, and other philanthropists who finally understand that homelessness isn't a choice. It's a systems failure. And when you fix the system, you fix lives. Some of the kids who've gone through his shelters are now in college. Some are working steady jobs. Some are starting families. Some are still struggling, but all of them know one thing. Someone believed they were worth the investment. And that belief, that single act of seeing a kid as a human being with potential instead of a problem to be managed, that changes everything. He's 42 now. He has enough money to retire and live comfortably for the rest of his life, but he's never even considered it, because the work isn't done. As long as there's a kid sleeping under a freeway in Los Angeles, a teenager hiding in a subway station in New York, a family living in a car in Phoenix, the work isn't done, and he's going to keep building. One shelter, one bed, one kid at a time, because he knows something most people don't. The distance between hopeless and hopeful is just one person who refuses to give up. And sometimes, that's all it takes. Oh, and one more thing. Remember David, the kid from the first shelter who just graduated from Stanford? He closed his first funding round last week, $50 million. He's breaking ground on his first 10 shelters next month, and he's not the only one. There's a network forming, a movement of people who survived the streets and are now dismantling the systems that put them there. The revolution isn't coming. It's already here. Wealth can buy a lot of things, but the only wealth that actually matters is the kind that repairs what's broken. That's not a metaphor. That's a fact. If this story moved you, I'd love for you to stick around for the next one. Because there's a tech billionaire who spent 7 years sleeping in his car and now funds startups exclusively for homeless youth. His story is just as wild, and it'll challenge everything you think you know about who deserves a second chance. I'll see you there.